On the small island of Tinian, one of the most decisive and brutal battles of the Pacific War unfolded. What began with Japanese tanks making desperate last stands quickly turned into a systematic push by the Marines, who endured sweltering heat, relentless rains, hidden mines, and ambushes in dense terrain. Despite these dangers, the American forces advanced with precision, securing airfields, driving the enemy into corners of the island, and crushing every last attempt at counterattack. The Japanese suffered catastrophic losses, with more than 9,000 soldiers killed, thousands of civilians dead or forced into hiding, and only a handful captured alive. The Marines also paid a heavy price, losing over 2,100 men in the 4th Division and hundreds more from the 2nd Division, yet their sacrifice secured victory. The capture of Tinian gave the United States a vital foothold, turning the island into a launch site for B-29 bombers, which soon devastated Japan's homeland and ultimately paved the way for the atomic strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This operation, remembered by commanders as the perfect amphibious assault, came at a high cost but delivered an immense strategic advantage that helped bring the Pacific War closer to its end. A quarrel between an admiral and a general produced what became regarded as the most flawless amphibious landing of the Pacific War. Located in the Northern Marianas, Tinian sits roughly 1,500 miles from the Japanese mainland, about 100 miles north of Guam and 3 miles southwest of Saipan. At barely 39 square miles, it was a tropical isle long ruled by Spain and then Germany before Japan took it in 1914 for agricultural purposes. As the war progressed, the Japanese bolstered its defenses once they realized it could serve as a B29 Superfortress base and as the launching point for the American atomic missions against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Today, Tinian is best known for those strikes. But in July 1944, it was simply the last in a chain of Pacific stepping stones toward the Japanese home islands. While the seizure of Saipan was still underway, Lieutenant General Holland "Howlin' Mad" Smith and his expeditionary forces turned their attention to Tinian, then garrisoned by about 9,000 Japanese troops. Smith predicted Tinian would be, in his words, the most perfect amphibious operation of the Pacific War. Senior American commanders, however, became embroiled in a bitter dispute over which beaches to use. Vice Admiral Richmond K. "Terrible" Turner advocated landing at Yellow Beach on the island's northeast shore, while Smith, backed by Rear Admiral Harry W. Hill and Major General Harry Schmidt, pushed for White Beach 1 and White Beach 2 on the north end, both of which measured under 200 yards across. Turner argued that doctrine required a beach roughly 1,000 yards wide to support a division. Planners countered that White 1 could handle 8 amphibious tractors at once and White 2 up to 16. Admiral Hill left one planning session complaining that Turner would not listen and had again demanded Smith prepare plans for a town landing while halting work on the White Beaches. Smith later recalled that the meeting aboard USS Rocky Mount erupted in profanity and set the stage for a full confrontation. Turner bluntly told Smith he would not permit landings on the White Beaches. Smith replied that tactical planning was his responsibility and that Turner merely needed to say whether he could land troops there. Turner insisted 2 divisions could not be put ashore on such narrow strips. Smith accused him of being overly fearful for his ships. The argument went on for hours as each man pressed his case. Smith warned that landing at Tinian town risked another Tarawa, heavy, costly casualties, and pointed to the upcoming beach reconnaissance by amphibious recon units. Turner, dismissive, scoffed at the recon Marines and suggested anyone who treated the reconnaissance seriously would be mocked. Smith threatened to take the dispute up to Admiral Raymond Spruance of the 5th Fleet and, if necessary, to Admiral Chester Nimitz. Hill later wrote that he had never seen Turner so rude and angry. Ultimately, the amphibious reconnaissance forces settled the matter. The unit had been formed at Camp Lejeune in January 1943, renamed the Amphibious Reconnaissance Company, Amphibious Corps Pacific Fleet in August 1943, and on April 14, 1944, at Smith's request, expanded into a two-company formation designated the V Amphibious Reconnaissance Battalion, Amphibious Corps, Pacific Fleet under Major James L. Jones, father of the future Commandant James L. Jones, Jr., the V Amphibious Recon Battalion, together with underwater demolition teams 5 and 7, was ordered to make a nighttime survey of Tinian's beaches. Their complex mission included locating any beach obstacles, measuring cliff heights and the vegetation behind the shore, charting the offshore reef and depths, assessing what vehicles could cross the reef and move inland, and deciding whether infantry could scale the cliffs without cargo nets or ladders. White Beach 1 was assigned to 1st Lieutenant Leo B. Shin's Company B and 12 swimmers from UDT 5, led by noted frogman Lieutenant Draper Kaufman. Company A under Silverthorne Jr., and a detachment from UDT 7 were given Yellow Beach. Battalion leaders and selected NCOs boarded USS Gilmer, APD-1, a transport destroyer converted from a World War I four-stack ship, on July 8th and steamed the island's west coast to gain orientation. As Shin explained, the crews let them study the beaches with binoculars and learn the island's horizontal silhouette. The following evening, both recon companies rehearsed off the purple beaches in Mawson Bay with swimmers from UDT 7 and agreed. The UDTs would conduct hydrographic work while the Marines would recon the beach proper and inland terrain. Shin recalled that 10 black neoprene rubber landing craft, LCRs, were launched from the APD at midnight from about 3,000 yards out. Shipboats towed the LCRs to roughly 9,500 yards off the shore. Each swimmer carried an inflatable CO2 life belt, a torch, and a packet of Aviator's yellow emergency dye, and they entered the water about 500 yards from shore and paddled the LCRs in. The rehearsal proceeded as planned and ended around 500. The real reconnaissance was set for the night of July 10-11, after a day filled with final planning, briefings, and intensive study of every available aerial photograph and chart. The recon Marines and frogmen were to be taken by USS Gilmer and USS Stringham to a point about 3,000 yards offshore, launch 10-man rubber boats towed by landing craft with muffled exhausts, and then paddle to positions just outside the surf some 500 yards off their assigned beaches. To preserve secrecy and avoid alerting the Japanese, teams were ordered not to disturb any mines or obstacles they encountered. For Yellow Beach, Captain Silverthorne selected 20 swimmers from Company A plus 8 from Lieutenant Richard F. Burks' UDT 7. At 10:45 p.m., under an overcast sky that hid the moon, the team put to sea. When the rubber boats were roughly 500 yards out, two sharp, rifle-like reports with flashes were heard off the south end of the main Yellow Beach. Major Jones, following orders to remain covert, directed the boats to move north to gather hydrographic data near the reef, after which two dull blasts like mortar rounds were heard. UDT-7 discovered underwater boulders, potholes, and floating mines in the approaches, and swimmers reported nearly impassable cliffs, 20 to 25 feet high along the margins of the roughly 125-yard-wide beach. Marines under 2nd Lieutenant Donald F. Neff found double-apron barbed wire at the high water mark, halting his men at the surf line. Neff crawled through the wire to find an exit about 30 yards inland, armed only with a knife. As he crept along, he could hear Japanese. Work crews close by and at one point saw 3 Japanese, sentries watching the shoreline from the cliff edge. They swept the sand with their lights, but still could not spot him. Lieutenant Donald Neff discovered the Japanese were preparing defenses exactly where the Americans planned to land, endured a terrifying interval ashore, then swam back to the rubber boat with his comrades. Neff had led Company A's reconnaissance that night and later received the Silver Star. Reconnaissance reports to Task Force 52's commander showed Yellow Beach had too heavy a surf, steep cliffs and narrow exits for a mass landing, so the assault was limited to White Beaches 1 and 2. First Lieutenant Leo B. Shin split his men into 2 teams, one to examine the northernmost White Beach, one and the other to probe White Beach 2. Later recollections put the beaches, widths at roughly 60 and 100, 60 yards with a stretch of rocky coast between them. Both squads left USS Gilmer about 23:30, and everything went according to plan until the LCRs were cast off. A strong northerly tidal current swept both boats northward. The White Beach 1 party never reached shore, grounding on a coral ledge some 800 yards north. Without that outcrop, they would have been carried deeper into the channel. The White Beach 2 team pressed on to examine the shore while UDT swimmers combed the nearshore for hazards. Lieutenant J.G. George Surin led a party of frogmen who crawled onto the beach above the high water line to check a tip about mines and found none. Recovering the rubber boats proved difficult in the northerly current and low scud and fog. Several men missed the pickup and were swept into the channel between Tinian and Saipan. After hours fighting to stay afloat, they were picked up by picket boat USS Dickerson. Fortunately, their life jackets' inflation bladders kept them buoyant. Because only half the objective had been checked, Major Jones ordered Silverthorne's Company A to reconnoiter White Beach 2 the next night. The revised plan called for men to be put ashore from USS Stringham and recovered by USS Gilmer, using a makeshift radar reflector system, a tripod wrapped in wire mesh and steel helmets to assist radio guidance. 5 rubber boats carrying swimmers and paddlers were towed to about 1,100 yards out and then released. Company B supplied and manned the boats while 12 UDT swimmers accompanied the recon teams. Guided by radio signals and the reflector, the ship steered the boats to a point roughly 100 yards south of White Beach 2 and about 400 yards offshore. To remain silent, each team slipped over the side and swam in on side stroke or breaststroke with heads kept above water and faces and necks darkened for camouflage. Jagged coral lacerated several men, but the reef was deep enough in places to allow a covert crossing. The recon Marines found no wire, mines, or other obstacles, and no signs of enemy activity. UDTs examined the offshore reef and approaches. At one point, a Japanese sentry almost stepped within inches of 2 Marines lying exposed on the sand, but they went unnoticed. The teams completed their work and returned to the rescue ships on schedule. Silverthorne reported a thorough survey of surf, reef, beach, and flanks to Rear Admiral Hill. The beaches were narrow but clear, no mines. Coral heads, boulders, wire obstacles, or offshore reefs. In his words, the beaches were as flat as a pool table. Hill was convinced Silverthorne was awarded the Silver Star. And the Landing Force Operations Officer praised the Reconnaissance Battalion and the UDTs for what he called an almost perfectly executed operation. Because Hill's earlier recommendation for the White Beaches had been resisted, Admiral Spruance convened the principal commanders on the afternoon of July 12th. Rear Admiral Hill and Lieutenant General Holland Smith argued the case for White Beaches. After the reconnaissance, Turner accepted the plan. Turner later said he had intended to approve the White Beaches unless reconnaissance proved otherwise, and only wanted every candidate landing area carefully examined before deciding, which reassured his colleagues. By mid-afternoon on July 24th, elements of Major General Clifton B. Cates's 4th Marine Division had crossed the White Beaches with relatively light casualties. The 2nd Marine Division followed the next day. Both divisions had recent scars. Over the previous 18 months, the 2nd Marines had been badly mauled, thousands lost to disease, or battle at Guadalcanal and Tarawa and heavy casualties again at Saipan, so neither unit looked forward to another brutal fight. The 4th Division, though newer, had also been blooded earlier in the year in the Marshalls and arrived at Tinian understrength after Saipan. Battalion averages had fallen from about 880 men to roughly 565, a reduction of more than 35%. Major Carl W. Hoffman noted that despite their exhaustion after a grueling 25-day fight and only a brief 2-day rest, morale for the Tinian operation remained generally high. The attitude was more a weary, "here we go again," than open complaint. Rear Admiral Hill authorized heavy naval gunfire across the island's 5 fire support sectors to confuse and suppress the defenders and steady the Marines before the assault. Tinian town took the heaviest punishment. Cruisers Cleveland and Louisville, 7 destroyers, and the battleships California, Tennessee, and Colorado pounded shore positions. Two 6-inch coastal defense guns that threatened the white beaches were knocked out by Colorado's 16-inch batteries. Japanese return fire cost the U.S. Navy 43 sailors killed and about 198 wounded, and Tennessee later joined in finishing off the coastal batteries. On J-Day, the Tinian equivalent of D-Day, the naval bombardment was suspended 3 times so American aircraft could strike roads, rail junctions, pillboxes, and gun positions. Nearly 350 Navy and Army planes took part, expending hundreds of bombs, dozens of napalm canisters and incendiary clusters, and firing scores of rockets. The 4th Marine Division then moved aboard some 37 LSTs anchored near Saipan. Once the soften-up ended, they received water, medical supplies, ammunition, and 3 days' rations beginning July 15th. Vehicles and heavier equipment had been preloaded, and the Marines were ordered to go ashore light, leaving packs behind so they would move faster. They carried only the barest personal items: a spoon, a spare pair of socks, insect repellent, and a few emergency supplies tucked in pockets. And on July 24th, the 4th Marine Division, nicknamed the Assault Division, stood off for Tinian. Because the landing beaches were too narrow to accept whole battalions, assault units went ashore in company, platoon, and squad columns. Major General Clifton B. Cates committed 2 regiments first, while the 3rd prepared to hit the thinner defended northwest beaches. To pin Japanese forces in Tinian town, the 2nd Marine Division under Watson staged a diversionary landing. The ruse drew a full battalion of the Japanese 50th Infantry and elements of the 56th Naval Guard into positions around the town. Confident that the feint had beaten back an invasion, the Japanese commander radioed Tokyo claiming he had repulsed 100 landing craft, unaware that the 25th Marines were already striking. White Beach 2 and the 24th Marines were hitting. White Beach 1 and LVTs, landing vehicle tracked, aka Amtraks or alligators. The loaded LVTs endured a 26-minute run to the shore, taking scattered and largely ineffective rifle and machine gun fire. A few defenders holed up in caves fired on the 24th Marines' first wave, but were quickly silenced. By 8:20 a.m., the entire 2nd Battalion of the 24th was ashore, and within an hour, both the 24th's 1st and 2nd Battalions were landed on White One and moving inland despite intermittent artillery, mortar, and small arms fire. By 4 p.m., the battalion reached the western edge of Airfield No. 3 and severed the main road linking Airfield No. 1 with the island's east coast and southern districts. The 1st Battalion faced stiffer resistance where defenders fired from caves. Flame-throwing tanks were called up, and the 24th's 3rd Battalion, kept in reserve near the beach, was committed. The 25th Marines landing at White Beach 2 struck an undetected minefield. 3 LVTs and a jeep were blown up, and mines took about 6 hours to clear. Enemy saboteurs had also hidden explosive devices in beer cases and other debris to maim or kill unwary Marines. As the 25th pushed inland, they ran into elements of the Japanese 50th Regiment, well dug into ravines, caves, and pillboxes, and chose to bypass some strong points with the intention of reducing them later. Ogata's headquarters, roughly 2.5 miles away on Notsu Lesso, came under harassing artillery fire. The confusion at the beach was typical of any assault. Recalled Jumping Joe Chambers, but by dusk the 2 regiments had dug in, forming a crescent-shaped beachhead roughly 3,000 yards long along the shore and bulging about 1,500 yards inland. The 23rd Regiment, the 4th Division's reserve, suffered delays unrelated to enemy action. Held on LSTs most of the day, they were finally ordered into landing craft at 1400 hours. Colonel Lays R. Jones, the regimental commander, endured severe communications problems and could not reach his battalions or division for long stretches. An engine failure in his LVT added to the delay, and it took 7 hours to get his vehicle ashore. Despite those holdups, more than 15,000 Marines were ashore with 4 artillery battalions, 20 half-tracks mounting 75mm guns, 48 medium Sherman tanks, and 15 flame tanks. The beachhead extended nearly a mile inland. Casualties for the day were comparatively light, about 15 Marines killed and 225 wounded against an estimated 438 Japanese dead. Which one historian judged a good day's work? With support from the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, the 24th secured the northern arc of the crescent, while the 25th and a battalion of the 23rd held the southern sectors. The remainder of the 23rd remained in reserve. Engineer units, special troops, and artillery from the 10th and 14th Marines were deployed on the beaches behind them. Commanders expected a night counterattack. Japanese forces were known for fighting tenaciously, and after dark, those fears were realized. Having seen his communications to subordinate units cut by the bombardment, Ogata ordered his island forces to counterattack wherever possible, determined to give the emperor a gallant showing even in defeat. At about 22 to 30 hours, a Japanese mobile, counterattack force and roughly 900 men of the 135th Infantry probed the center of the Marine line where the 24th, 2nd, and 3rd Battalions were dug in. Artillery was alerted as attackers gathered. A large ravine ran into the western edge of the Marine position, and Chambers later wrote that its use in a counterstroke should have been obvious. Men reported hearing Japanese movement in the gully during the night. Around midnight, the assault struck K Company's sector. Enemy troops manhandled two 75mm howitzers into firing positions and pummeled Marine lines. Despite heavy pressure, some 150 to 200 attackers reached the beach area. The defenders, aided by close artillery and machine gun fire, held. On the left flank, Lieutenant Mickey McGuire fired canister rounds at close range. Gunners such as PFC Alfred J. DeGell and a comrade named Showers delivered devastating machine gun fire until both were killed at their posts. The next morning, 251 Japanese bodies were found in front of their gun. Doggle was awarded a posthumous Navy Cross and Showers a posthumous Silver Star. Major Robert the Farneman's two tank companies arrived just before dawn and were rushed forward to support companies K and L. Neiman later reported that the battlefield already bore an incredible number of enemy dead. 50 caliber heavy machine guns and 75mm pack howitzers played a major role in beating back the attack. At about 0200, the 1st Battalion, 24th Marines absorbed an attack by roughly 600 Special Naval Landing Force troops launched from nearby airfields. Company A was hammered so badly, it had to call on engineers, corpsmen, and signal party men to hold the line, leaving only about 30 riflemen able to fight. Illumination flares lit the battlefield while Marines used 37mm canister, machine guns, rifles, and mortars to repel the wave. Fighting subsided only after Sherman tanks of the 4th Tank Battalion arrived at dawn. By daybreak, some accounts reported 476 Japanese dead found on the field, many directly in front of Company A, and numerous attackers had blown themselves up with grenades rather than be taken alive. Later that morning, fresh Japanese attacks began again. One offensive launched about 0330 on the 25th, committed with perhaps half their remaining force, and the 23rd Marines, pushing north of Tinian town, ran into withering fire. Reporters described lead tanks burning and crashing under the hail of anti-tank and small arms fire as the desperate fighting continued. They poured fire into the ditches in a last, hopeless bid to break out. One tank stopped after moving roughly 100 yards. A third tried frantically to turn and bolt, but Marines closed in and blew it apart. A bazooka hit wrecked a 4th tank and killed its driver. The remaining crewmen scrambled from the turret only to be surrounded. The 5th armored vehicle attempted to flee but was quickly dealt with, while a 6th managed to get away briefly after a later strike set it afire and cremate its crew. Even without armored support, parts of the Japanese 50th Regiment launched attacks on the 2nd Battalion, 23rd Marines, only to be shredded by 37mm anti-tank canister rounds. Skirmishing continued with small enemy bands repeatedly throwing themselves at Marine positions, but achieving nothing. Fewer than 100 Marines were killed or wounded, while at dawn on July 25th, some 1,141 Japanese bodies lay across the battlefield. Contemporaries believed that hundreds more had been removed by their comrades. By the second day after the landings, the Japanese defense had effectively collapsed. Colonel Ogata had lost control of his forces when communications failed, and it was mostly a matter of time before Tinian was secure. Though isolated pockets of resistance would flare up at night and then melt away until there was nowhere left to retreat. Marine historian later wrote that the two divisions advanced methodically south from White Beaches 1 and 2, reducing fortifications, pushing Japanese forces aside and consolidating ground. Whenever enemy soldiers tried banzai charges or attempted night infiltrations, the Marines met them. Colonel Goodham McCormick, the 4th Division's intelligence officer, said his command had expected a large coordinated counterattack and braced for a hard fight that, day after day, simply never materialized. Lieutenant Colonel William W. Buchanan, the 4th Division's assistant naval gunfire officer, recalled the tactic was to flush out enemy positions steadily as they advanced rather than funneling down main roads, a deliberate, line-by-line sweep that was tedious but safest. Again, the remaining resistance was driven to the island's edge and quickly collapsed. The work was anything but easy. Marines were exhausted by heat and humidity, drenched by sudden monsoon downpours, and constantly threatened by mines, booby traps, snipers, and surprise ambushes from the jungle. Major General Watson's 2nd Marine Division moved in to help mop up the island. On July 26, the 2nd seized the northern airfields and then pushed south. Within 2 days, those strips were ready to host Army P-47 Thunderbolt fighters. The 4th also took Mount Maga on the 26th, forcing Colonel Ogata and his staff to abandon their command post on Mount Lasso, which the Marines occupied without firing a shot. The southward drive began on July 27th with the 2nd and 4th spread in a broad skirmish line across the island. Opposition was light and losses were modest. The 4th Tank Battalion captured the Gergen Point airstrip the next day. When asked later how he inspired his men, Major General Cates said he joked about getting back to Maui, pointing to distant ships and telling them the sooner they finished, the sooner they'd be home. To conserve dwindling ammunition, commanders curtailed routine preparatory barrages. Shelling empty, abandoned positions was judged wasteful. By dusk on July 29th, Marines held the northern half of the island. Those stubborn pockets resisted as the 4th advanced on Tinian town amid torrential rain. An enemy ground probe was repelled and Japanese mortars and artillery struck the 3rd Battalion, 25th Marines. Colonel Franklin A. Hart's 24th Marine Regiment was tasked with taking Tinian town the following day, supported by divisional artillery and naval gunfire from cruisers and destroyers. When the 24th's 1st Battalion drew intense fire from caves along the town's north coast, flame tanks silenced the positions and engineers sealed cave entrances with explosives. By about 1400 on July 30th, the 24th entered a shattered, near-empty Tinian town. A lone Mitsubishi Zero sat abandoned on a broken coral runway. Around the same time, the 25th secured Airfield No. 4 on the town's eastern edge, and that night, elements of the 23rd Marines and 1st Battalion, 8th Marines relieved the 24th. The 2nd Division pressed eastward and met stiff resistance until it tracked an enemy group into a large cave. With the aid of a flame tank, about 89 Japanese were killed and 4 machine guns destroyed. By 1830, the 2nd halted for the night. American forces now controlled roughly 80% of the island and prepared for a final push. Late on July 30th, Major General Schmidt ordered both divisions to drive to the southeast coast, clear enemy-held ground, and annihilate remaining defenders. In that final redoubt, some 500 men of the 56th Naval Guard Force and perhaps as many as 1,800 troops of the 50th Infantry Regiment were dug into caves, cliffs, and a plateau, determined to die for the Emperor. Marine and Army guns shelled those positions through the night of July 30-31, while, at dawn, battleships Tennessee and California and cruisers Louisville, Montpelier, and Birmingham launched a 75-minute bombardment. Fire was paused for 40 minutes to allow 126 P-47 fighters, B-25 bombers, and carrier TBF Avengers to conduct a 40-minute airstrike that dropped roughly 69 tons of explosives. Naval gunfire then resumed for another 35 minutes. One historian estimated cruisers and battleships fired some 615 tons of ammunition that night. The 10th Marine Artillery fired about 5,000 rounds, and the 14th about 2,000. A captured prisoner later described the pounding as almost unbearable. The Japanese had built a near-perfect defensive system. Mortars and small arms raked Marines as they tried to climb mined, steep slopes where tanks could not operate and undergrowth was dense. Armored amphibians patrolling the coast were tasked with suppressing beach fire. A company-sized Japanese force launched a suicidal counterattack against the 1st Battalion. 24th Marines around 1,000 hours and was wiped out. The 1st Battalion, 23rd Marines encountered fierce resistance, including a hidden heavy weapon that momentarily pinned them until Shermans knocked it out. Marines discovered a concealed concrete bunker housing 20 defenders. All inside were killed. In another sector, a disabled Sherman was seized by Japanese troops and turned into an armored machine gun nest until an American tank destroyed it. As additional battalions enveloped the area and pushed up the slopes, the 1st Battalion, 23rd Marines, and a company from the 2nd Battalion finally reached the plateau's summit by late afternoon. Elements of the 2nd Battalion and the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines arrived soon after and held the high ground overnight. Company commander, Captain Carl W. Hoffman, described the night of July 31st on the plateau. They had little daylight left to emplace barbed wire, set up fields of fire or interlocking machine gun sectors. After dark, the enemy probed and a few Japanese infiltrated their lines. The night was pitch black because the Japanese had shifted positions, and Marines were tense and challenged anyone who moved. Fortunately, there were no friendly fire incidents. The enemy's attacks grew in ferocity until a full-scale banzai assault came in successive waves against a 37mm post. Gunners fell and were immediately replaced, and soon dead attackers lay almost shoulder-high in front of the piece. By dawn, the Marines had routed the assault and hundreds of enemy dead lay around. Hoffman, who had brought a trumpet, played to calm his men. During the brief concert, a lone Japanese soldier charged the barbed wire and was cut down before he could throw his grenade, after which Hoffman continued his little concert. Fighting persisted for 2 more days. Although the Japanese inflicted some casualties, they suffered massive losses. General Schmidt declared Tinian secure at 6:55 p.m. on August 1st. Ogata reportedly committed suicide that day, though some defenders unaware of the surrender continued to charge Marine lines or hide for months afterward. The last known holdout, Maruta Susumu, was not discovered until 1953, living as a civilian employed by NKK, the large Marianas sugar company, rather than as a soldier. As many as 10,000 civilians had sheltered in caves during the battle and only gradually emerged, uncertain of their fate. Rough estimates put the islands dead at about 4,000. Marines on nearby islands had seen terrified villagers fling themselves from cliffs in fear of capture. Mass suicides of that scale were uncommon on Tinian, but some civilians moving near Marine lines at night were accidentally shot, and others were driven toward American positions by Japanese who had strapped explosives to them or, in some cases, were forced over cliffs by retreating Japanese troops. On August 14th, Major General Cates and his entire 4th Marine Division sailed to its base camp at Maui, fulfilling his pledge to the men to get them home. The division had lost over 1,100 men in the campaign, including 212 killed in the Tinian operation. Its next assignment was Iwo Jima, where it would later suffer further casualties. The 2nd Marine Division remained in the Marianas until the end of the war. Fewer than 400 of the roughly 9,000 Japanese defenders on Tinian were taken prisoner. Almost all the rest were killed. Admiral Spruance called the landing of 42,000 men and equipment across the narrow white beaches the most brilliantly conceived and executed amphibious operation of World War II. Holland Smith called it the perfect amphibious operation. Thanks largely to the V Amphibious Reconnaissance Battalion, the Marianas provided the Army Air Forces with bases from which to strike Japan. When Tinian was secure, the island lay about 1,200 nautical miles from the Japanese home islands, ideal for the B-29's roughly 2,800-mile range. 2 20th Air Force wings were established on Tinian, and 3 months after its capture, B-29s were striking the Japanese mainland. Air Force figures show that during the following year, B-29s flying from the Marianas flew some 29,000 sorties and dropped about 157,000 tons of bombs. Japanese sources later claimed these raids caused roughly 260,000 deaths, displaced about 2,200,000 people, and destroyed or burned approximately 210,000 dwellings. Tinian's place in military history was cemented on August 6, 1945, when the Enola Gay departed the island to vaporize Hiroshima with an atomic bomb. A second bomb struck Nagasaki 2 days later, and the Japanese government surrendered shortly thereafter. Richard W. Johnston, writing the official history of the 2nd Marine Division, recorded that upon hearing the surrender, the men thought of the forbidding Japanese coasts that might otherwise have awaited them that autumn, and looked back at Tinian's neat, rocky shoreline and the coral beaches where they had landed. Many of them felt, as one Marine put it, that